Trumponomics, how closely does it resemble Reaganomics?
You know, there's similarities, particularly on tax reform and rolling back regulations. Reagan wanted to lower marginal tax rates. In those days, the bigger problem was individual rates at 70%. These days, I think it's business rates, frankly. But Trump has both. So a lot of similarities. They both believed in the incentive model of growth by lowering tax rates. And one more quick one. They both wanted to roll back regulations.
Right.
Reagan deregulated the price of oil first day in office. And, of course, Trump has a whole laundry list. We didn't get what we wanted with David Stockman, but, you know, those two, taxes and regulations, they're very similar.
David, for you, the big concern is debt accumulation. I mean,
Right.
that's what worries you most about Trumponomics.
Yeah, this isn't the second coming of Ronald Reagan. I wish him well. But the world today is night and day different from what it was then. We had $930 billion of debt, not much, a clean balance sheet at the federal level.
Relative to the size of the economy at the time.
30% of GDP.
Yeah.
Today it's $20 trillion and 106% of GDP. As we looked out 4 or 5 years then, we had a big surplus. As we look out today, by CBO's light, we have a $10 trillion more of debt on top of the 20 we already have. Beyond that, in 1981, taxes were 19.5% of GDP. We had high inflation, and we weren't indexed. So taxes were headed to 24% of GDP. We could cut the prospective increase, and it would have been good for the economy. Last year, taxes were 17.8% of GDP. There's no inflation. They're indexed. They're going nowhere. So the idea that we're going to have some big Trump fiscal stimulus is so wrong. The market is so delusional.
It's not.
We're going to have, Larry, if I could just say, we're going to have a fiscal bloodbath because there's no room for a huge tax cut funded by borrowing like we had in the mid-1980s. This is a different world.
Okay.
You know, we're out of balance sheet. We're out of runway.
I acknowledge it's a different world.
Yeah.
There's a stagnant growth. So that's similar. We don't have the double-digit inflation.
Different point in the cycle, though.
But the idea of this term fiscal stimulus troubles me because I'm going to argue on lower tax rates and rolling back regulations. This is a supply-side policy from Trump, just as Reagan had a supply-side policy. Nobody believed us then. Nobody believed Reagan then. Nobody believes Trump now. I've taken the brunt of a lot of that criticism with Steve Moore and many others. Anyway, my point is, if Trump gets his lower tax rates, particularly business, and gets to roll back regulations, the economy's potential to grow is going to be fantastic. But where they differ, and I want to put this in, Reagan was basically a free trader, not perfect, but basically. Mr. Trump is making a lot of protectionist sounds, and Reagan was absolutely in favor of a strong and steady dollar. President Trump is undermining the dollar, and those are two big
But he
issues
did put
and
quotas
differences
on Japanese
between
cars.
the two.
I mean, he did put quotas on Japanese
He was
sodas.
imperfect. He was imperfect. We lost a couple.
You know, clearly Larry and Art Laffer have become the evangelists for supply-side economics. Do you buy it as much as they do?
I'm all for supply side. The economy desperately needs less regulation and lower rates, but we can't afford a 6% of GDP deficit from huge tax cuts and defense buildups like Reagan had. Reagan was the biggest accidental Keynesian in history.
Okay, so how do you grow the economy then, David?
We grow it very slowly, and it's going to be
Isn't that what we've been doing?
Tough slog. I agree that we should try to reform taxes, corporate taxes, but you're going to pay for it with a border adjustment tax or loophole closing. Okay. Okay. And so, but
what's
the
that
point
going to
is,
do to the
hang on one
economy and
second.
supply chain?
The point is, you're not going to pay for it by borrowing, because we're already facing trillion-dollar deficits 1 or 2 years down the road based on what's built in already. That back then, the baby boom was just entering the labor force. We're now retiring at 10,000 a day. Back then, they were still starving in the rice paddies in China from Mao's famine. Today, a huge part of our industrial base has been offshored. So the idea that we'll have a sudden boom is wrong.
Okay.
It's going to be slow
But here's
going
the thing.
over a long period of time.
I think David continues to underestimate the power of growth. Look, I love him. He's a great man. But he continues to underestimate the power of growth. That's my basic response. I don't want 1 to 2%. I think growth solves so many problems. We will grow our way out. of these budget deficits, just
Not
as
a
we
chance,
did
Larry,
in the 80s
Larry,
and 90s.
No, not a
we
chance.
will grow our way out.
We didn't.
Let
we
me
didn't.
hang
First
on.
of all,
Let me
let's
make
get,
this
Larry,
point.
hang
Let
on,
me make
hang
this
on.
point.
Let's get the history right.
No, I'm going to
Ronald Reagan inherited $930 billion of debt from 39 presidents in 190 years. He added $1.8 trillion in 8 years.
And the economy was spectacular.
The economy was
spectacular.
No, it wasn't. We had 3 or 4 years of good growth from the Keynesian deficits, and then we had the Fed printing money for years.
Reagan launched. My response.
Yeah.
Reagan launched a 2-decade economic boom. And towards the end of that 2-decade economic boom, we actually saw balanced budgets and even surpluses for a while. My key point is a simple point. I want a steady dollar, and I'm a free trader. So I disagree with President Trump. However, he and Reagan are on target together with lower marginal tax rates and rolling back regulations. The power of growth will overwhelm everything.